And so when you have public ownership of these key pieces of a green economy, that's when you get that ability to transition quickly. Like if we need to actually shut down the coal plant and bring up another plant as quickly as possible, you're going to be able to do that better if it's publicly owned. It's going to be slower, it's going to be less efficient if you're farming that out to the market, because they're always concerned about profits, and we don't have to be.
Welcome to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy. My name is Clement Nokos, editor of Perspectives Journal and director of policy and engagement at the Broadband Institute. On October 17, 2023, the Green Economy Network, a coalition of labor, environmental, and social justice organizations working to build a green economy in Canada, held a workshop in Ottawa at the Canadian Labour Congress to present its updated Common Platform, an action plan for investments in job creation and emissions reductions in key economic sectors. To accompany the Common Platform, the Green Economy Network hosted a discussion on green industrial policy in Canada, a crucial framework to build on public policy that can spur an economic transformation based on justice and equality. But before we get into the weeds of green industrial policy, just what the heck is it? To deconstruct the true meaning of industrial policy, Christine Jones, Industrial Decarbonization Program Manager at Blue Green Canada, leads and moderates this discussion. Also joining this panel is Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood, Senior Researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Angela McEwen, Senior Economist for the National Canadian Union of Public Employees and Broadband Institute Policy Fellow, as well as John Cartwright, Chairperson of the Council of Canadians. Here's their conversation on green industrial policy and what it means for Canada's economic transformation. This discussion has been edited for clarity and brevity.
So again, I'm really grateful to be here with all of you and to have an opportunity to find the ways that our collective work can move everybody's necessary agenda forward. I've been asked to moderate this discussion on green industrial policy, and I'm going to do a little bit of introduction. I think that we've already got a bit of a taste of who Hadrian, Angela, and John are. The reason we came together and we're asked to come together is we're a bunch of people that are nerds and feel profoundly passionate about how we can create the kind of economy that we need to have in Canada. That is an economy that is based on confident and logical thinking, on scientific fact and modeling, on human rights, and on the understanding that you don't have to trade off good jobs and defending our climate and our environment. That's actually what Blue Green's also founded on, in fact, is the belief that you don't have to pit those things against each other. And what this session is seeking to do today is essentially theory craft. The idea of green industrial policy and any industrial policy is actually a mammoth and quite technical and intricate thing. There are many parts to industrial policy. We also know that there are some things that often get equated back and forth to each other, but that can mean some different things. So we're going to have a little bit of an opportunity to hear from Hadrian, who has done some pretty substantial research in the area of green industrial policy. And he's going to help start our collective learning and demystifying some of the terms and concepts. We're going to hear from Angela, who's going to start really helping us collectively think about what things look like from, honestly, the bird's eye view of an economist who understands all of the different pieces that can go into an industrial policy. More importantly, probably, are those things that we don't often hear about that can go into an industrial policy. We're going to hear from John Cartwright, who's going to be situating this discussion a little bit more technically, which is really, really important, because we can have these theories, but in the end, we have to have the pieces that make the thing go, right? We have to understand what all of the component parts are that are going to be necessary for us to come together as a collective movement to really, really look at how we compel the federal government to require them, in fact, to do a green industrial policy that is actually for people versus the profit side of how our neoliberal governments tend to function. Each of our panelists are going to present some information for about 5 to 7 minutes. And then I'm going to do a little bit of a synthesis. And then our hope is to open up the floor for discussion, because we have to have these discussions together. We have to start understanding what different sectors and different parts of our movement need to see happen. And we have to make sure that we can have these discussions in spaces where the central part and where we start together, our basis of unity, is that we are working towards something ultimately positive and ultimately actually full of life and possibility. So without further babbling from me, I'd like to ask Hadrian, and 5 to 7 minutes is kind of what we agreed for the interventions at the beginning.
Thanks. I have 8 minutes, so I'll go fast. Yeah, I'm gonna just jump right into it. Okay, industrial policy. What is industrial policy? I think that's kind of what I'm gonna try and cover in my intro, is just get us all on the same page about what we're talking about, and then we'll get into more of the details. But generally speaking, industrial policy, kind of textbook definition, is just any intervention by the government, by the state in the economy, to promote or develop a specific industrial sector. There's an inherently strategic element to it. So, just cutting taxes for the entire corporate sector, it's not really industrial strategy. That's just a handout to the corporations. But maybe cutting taxes for the oil companies or cutting taxes for clean tech could be considered industrial strategy, because you're trying to strategically develop one or another industry or shift resources from one sector to another. And that means in practice, kind of any economic policy can be industrial policy, but the key piece is that the strategic element to it. Now, when we talk about green industrial policy, it's the same thing. It's government interventions in the economy, but specifically with the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, the distinction from climate policy, which is very focused on reducing emissions, a green industrial policy is about reducing emissions while also growing the economy, while building a cleaner economy. So it's kind of pairing climate policy and economic policy. In terms of kind of elements of industrial policy, I'd argue there are kind of 4 big buckets, 4 general, sets of tools. The first being public coordination. So this is kind of the least obvious form of policy, but it's actually arguably the most important, because governments are really in the best position to take a holistic view of the long-term economic development. And that in practice, that's challenging with our political system sometimes. But we need government to identify where a market is failing to advance the public interest. That's something really only government can do, only the public can do. And that includes things like workforce development. It includes things like sectoral councils, which John's going to talk about. But the coordinating piece is very important. That's an important part of industrial policy. The second is spending. And spending can take lots of different forms. You can have procurement, direct investment, financing, and so on. But this is the government actually, putting its money where its mouth is and saying, if this is a priority for us, for the public, then the public's going to spend money to achieve that goal. And again, there's lots of different ways that we can come up with that money or whatever. But we know that especially in the context of decarbonization, we've got a spending gap of about $100 billion a year that the economy needs to make up. Doesn't mean the public has to make up all that money, but we need to come up with some more money to actually achieve decarbonization. So we've got public coordination, public spending, and then we look at the private sector, the first one being commercial subsidies. So this is often what people think the extent of industrial policy is incentives to the private sector. These are kind of the carrots to say, come on board with our green agenda. We know you want to help. We know you care. So we're going to give you a break or some kind of funding or whatever to entice that private capital to contribute to a public goal. So we have that's our subsidy side. And then we pair that with our 4th category, which is regulatory measures. These are the disincentives, the sticks. These are tools to basically prevent the private sector from getting in the way. So between public coordination, public spending, commercial subsidies, and regulatory measures, that's kind of generally the universe of industrial policy. But you could argue that, again, like I said, almost any other policy could be industrial policy if it has that kind of strategic orientation. Now, when it comes to actually implementing it, there's kind of a spectrum of industrial policy, because you could argue that our government, like our current federal government and most governments, have had industrial policies. They've had very kind of market-based industrial policies, kind of a hands-off approach that's really focused on incentivizing private investment, prioritizing economic efficiency, which I put in quotation marks because it's not always efficient in practice. But the idea that this is low risk for the public, we're going to ask the private sector to do the heavy lifting of this transition. They take on the risk. They also get all the benefits. That's kind of the general orientation of our federal government. We're going to hear, I think, more about that from Angela. Then on the alternative, we have more state-led or publicly led industrial policy, one that prioritizes direct investment, even public ownership, and one that explicitly balances those kind of economic priorities with social and environmental priorities. So it doesn't throw out economic efficiency, but it says we have a lot of priorities as a public and we can achieve them together. So it's higher risk in theory, but also higher reward, and we actually achieve our goals. Really, 3 minutes?
Just keep going.
It's okay. It's okay. I was going to talk about
You're good.
our Canada's successful, one of our best examples of successful industrial policy in Canada being the oil sands, of course, because it was the conventional oil industry that fought against the oil sands. And the government, far-sighted provincial and federal governments, said, no, this is the future of the resource industry. We need to spend public money to invest in technology to unlock the oil sands. Once we've done that with public money, we need to heavily subsidize the industry so it can commercialize over the next few decades. And we did it. Successful industrial policy. We have a world-leading oil sands industry. Lots we can learn from that. Of course, that is not green industrial policy. But the point is that industrial policy is not new. And in fact, in the past few years, it's rather in vogue. All the biggest economies in the world, China, the EU, the US, are all implementing very explicit green industrial policies. Every government has an industrial policy, whether they say so or not, but it's become very explicit in the past few years that all the biggest economies are pursuing this sort of agenda. And so I'll finish just with a quick argument for why Canada also needs a strong publicly led green industrial policy. And I think there's kind of three big reasons. The first being competitiveness. The bottom line is all of the biggest economies are moving in a direction of kind of state supported in one way or another investment in key industries we know are going to matter in the next 50 years. And if we can't do the same, or we can't find a way to be competitive, that's going to hurt our economy. That's kind of the classic economic argument. There's also, of course, the urgency of the climate crisis. This is, it maybe if we had a lot of time, we just, have a carbon price and let the market figure it out. Give them 30, 40 years, the market's going to arrive at a cleanish economy and we don't have to intervene. Problem is we don't have 40 years. And this is a case where we actually know very clearly what we need to do. That's one of the nice things that work in climate policy is we actually kind of know what the problems are and we can fix them. We just need political will and strong policy. And then the last really important reason for a publicly led green industrial policy, something that's near and dear to my heart, something that Jen's worked a lot on, is the imperative of a just transition. And that's because if we don't pair transition programs for workers with industrial policies, it's essentially a dead end. What we're offering workers is a parachute, saying, here's a soft landing out of a declining industry. But if there's no job at the end of the road, it's a dead end. So we actually need economic alternatives, especially in the regions that are undergoing transition, something the market alone is not going to provide. You can put a whole bunch of money into the clean economy. That's all going to go into Calgary and Toronto. That's not where all that investment is needed. So in the end, a truly just transition is really impossible if we're not also creating new economic opportunities. And that's what a green industrial policy is all about.
Thank you. So I'm going to do a synthesis after we've heard from all three of the speakers. And so I'd like to ask Angela if you'd like to continue the story.
I mean, Hadrian's done a really good job of talking about what we think industrial policy is. I take a broader view even than Hadrian. So I think that there are sort of core economic policies of the government that affect industry. So they may seem to be neutral, but they're not. So if you have a tax incentive just for investment in machinery, for example, that is just a corporate write-off. But only companies that have the funds to make those investments are going to benefit. So you're actually, when you're making policies like that, seems like it's neutral, it's going to shift inequality. It's going to push stuff to people who already have the money. And so there are decisions that we make that aren't industrial policy, that aren't explicitly about shifting resources from one industry to another or one group to another, but have that effect. There are also policies that we have that can level the playing field for everyone. So there's this female economist who has a lot of wacky ideas, but one of her really great ideas, Hazel Henderson, look her up, but she has this idea of the economy as a cake and instead of a pie. Often we think about the pie, we have to make a bigger pie. She's like, no, if you think about the economy as a cake, the bottom layer is the environment, it's the planet. And then on top of that is public services. So it's the type of public services that we provide. And then on top of that, so then I forgot people, households. So women, the work that women traditionally did in maintaining households, having children, taking care of people. So we have the environment, we have households, we have public services, and then on top of that, the icing is the private sector. And so government makes all kinds of decisions in terms of the economy about how strong that environment is going to be. Are we protecting the environment? How do households allocate resources? How can we support households in doing that work and making sure that, kids are fed and elders are taken care of? And then the public sector can actually make it easier to set up shop. If we have affordable housing, it's easier to get workers. If we have free tuition, workers get trained better. If we have public transit, all of these pieces actually make the private sector work better and more efficiently. And so if we think about those policies as part of the policies we need to get right for a green transition, to have an economy that functions well, I think that that's really important, even if it's not traditionally what we call industrial policy. And so public ownership is a really important part of industrial policy for me. And I'm going to compare and contrast some of this government's industrial policies with what I think the better option is. So I grew up in Saskatchewan. If we're thinking about public industrial policy there, we have a public telephone system still. We're the only province in Canada that still has that. And so cell phones cost half the price in Saskatchewan as anywhere else, even though other options can compete. So when you have a public option, it lowers the price. It helps take the profit motive out of the equation. So people get a better deal. You can do the same thing with electricity. Several provinces still have partly owned public energy systems. When you have publicly owned energy systems, not only are you taking profit out of the equation, you're also, as Hadrian said, you're making decisions in the best interest of the population, not in where you can get profit from. And you're making longer term decisions. So it's not the next quarter. It's not, what is our share price going to be next quarter? Is this system manageable for the next 30, 50 years? And so when you have public ownership of these key pieces of a green economy, that's when you get that ability to transition quickly. Like if we need to actually shut down the coal plant and bring up another plant as quickly as possible, you're going to be able to do that better if it's publicly owned. It's going to be slower. It's going to be less efficient if you're farming that out to the market, because they're always concerned about profits, and we don't have to be. So when you need that transition to happen quickly, you want it to be publicly owned. So it improves the ability for coordination. So what we have in Ontario, where we've split up different pieces of electricity actually across Canada. So you have distribution being one part. It makes it harder to coordinate between those different actors and make sure that you're putting the resources where they need to be. We saw that in Ontario when we had renewable energy perhaps being built in places next to where there was already lots of energy being generated. And so you have these long transmission lines to places that don't have energy, or you have northern communities that are still using diesel because they didn't get the investment in the clean energy, because it was cheaper for the market to invest in other places. So when you have public ownership, when you have that public direction of where the investment is going, you can make those strategic decisions. One of the pieces that this government is doing, they have the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and they're using that for a green transition. And what the Canada Infrastructure Bank does is public-private partnerships. So when you have a market-based approach, you're either using tax incentives, or maybe you're using subsidies, or maybe you're using these things. And the idea is that there is some small barrier out there, usually cost. If you can make it a little bit cheaper to make this better decision, then you can do that. And you can do this nudge, you can kind of get people over the hump and they'll go in the right direction. What we've seen happen is investment in public transit in Ottawa, that because it's a public-private partnership, the private sector has tried to cut costs. And so it doesn't work. And so same in Toronto, we have the same thing happening in Edmonton. You have delays. So we have huge delays because we didn't just invest in the thing that we knew worked. That was more expensive up front. We tried to cut costs and it doesn't work. The same thing happening in a bunch of different areas. And so it also costs more over the long run, because what you're doing is you're outsourcing financing to the private sector. They want returns of like 7% on this money. the government can borrow always for less than what a public-private partnership offers. So what CUPE has, we have a campaign to turn the Canada Infrastructure Bank into a full public bank. The government can always borrow money at a lower cost than the private sector. And so they should actually be directly loaning money to these projects that we know have a public benefit, have a public good, and that we need to have happen very quickly. So that's a really, I think, important piece of public policy, that direct public ownership of key infrastructure that makes everything go, public transit, energy, and then to have that public money funding other specific projects.
So the story continued here, which is really important for us to consider about what we already have that we can actually literally transform in terms of institutions within our government and pieces of policy that we can transform. And it's a good way to start thinking about what's missing. So John's going to continue the story about some of the things that we actually have. And these are a bit more technical, but this is a very technical topic. And we have to really look at our approach to green industrial policy as a full spectrum approach. It's not just going to be that we can pick and pluck in one area. We really, and Angela spoke about it, and I think it's more broad. This is about full on coordination, right? So John, hello, good morning, and over.
Hi there. So John Todd, who was a groundbreaking environmental engineer, used to start his interventions at meetings like this saying, I'm here from the tool and die department of the environmental movement. And what I'm bringing to you today is based on about 30 years worth of campaigning for green jobs in a variety of areas. I want to build on Adrian and Angela's perspective around an industrial policy of the past. And every major industrial country, as they industrialize, had that policy. But there's many elements to it that include what's been said, but also basic infrastructure. When Ontario, and I'm going to use Ontario as an example, when they wanted to industrialize, first they had to get public electricity because the big industrialists were tired of being gouged by the private electricity providers. So they created Ontario Hydro. They had to have ports and roads and railways to serve the movement of goods. They had to have a workforce development, whether that was immigration or education, in order to provide the skilled workforce. Marketing was often done by governments as part of industrial policy. Research and development was often done through universities and other places to support industrial development. Public procurement policies, buy Canadian, buy union, whatever, were part of those. And I come back to cheap electricity. So it's a very full basket that industrial policy can imagine. But then they changed the rules. And we need to remember that the rules were changed. The Davos crowd wanted to bring in, a global market rather than national markets. And our free trade deals that Steve had just mentioned, disrupting one, that was really about taking the Reagan-Thatcher revolutions and expanding corporate power through market fundamentalism. So there's no barriers to trade, to cheap labor, to investment opportunities. And, put my Council of Canadians hat on, we were part of the main opposition, along with the labor movement and others, to the original free trade deal through NAFTA, FTTA, MAA, CETA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's part of the DNA of the Council of Canadians as the largest civil society organization partnering, taking on that unjust trade agenda. And it's interesting because the US never gave up their Made in America policies. They still have 70% requirement on transit vehicles, on infrastructure, US steel, US aluminum, US rebar, on energy. Long before the Biden's Act, they've had that stuff forever. I was at the founding convention of Blue Green down in Pittsburgh some years ago. And we were inspired by the story of Pennsylvania. It said to the energy companies, if you want to supply energy to us, the feed-in tariff, you have to make those things in the US. And they partnered with Gamesa from Spain, wind turbines in particular. And they reopened a number of shuttered factories to make the nacelles and the parts for those turbines. And we came back to Ontario and said, that's a fabulous idea. The Ontario government should do something similar. And Labour lobbied the Liberal government at the time to get the Green Energy Act. It was way more private sector oriented than we had wanted, but that became the flavor of the McGuinty government. And then, of course, in 2013, it was struck down by the WTO. And so now what we have as a policy is massive subsidies for batteries, for mines, for pipelines, the gateway, whatever. It's all about subsidies. So I'm going to talk about three things: regulation, carbon pricing, and sectoral councils. But first, I want to remind us about what the economy actually looks like, because strategies need to have eyes wide open. So there's 1.7 million Canadians working in manufacturing. There's 1.5 million Canadians working in construction. There's 2.9 million working in wholesale and retail that sell the goods that people want. There's 1 million working in transportation and warehousing that move the goods that people want. And then on the public sector, back to Angela's point, there's 2.6 million working in healthcare, 1.4 million working in education, and 1 million working in public administration. But there's 1 million working in hotels, restaurants, accommodation. There's 690,000 working in building services, including waste. Oil, gas, mining, and quarrying all together has 266,000. Forest industry has 46,000. Now, there's lots of wealth, massive wealth created in those sectors. But when we're thinking about why the government should focus on green industrial policy as compared to what Daniel Smith and Scott Moe want us to concentrate on, this is the scale. We have lots of public policy levers to further a green industrial policy. I mean, Canada Post runs the largest vehicle fleet in the country, and the postal workers have done a great job with their Delivering Community Power campaign, arguing about how that massive infrastructure across the country, if there was solar, if there were charging stations, if that fleet was electrified, if it include food to table, could transform that public enterprise. And we have our municipalities and our transit agencies, there's tons and tons of capacity that are out there. And the scale of the opportunity is this: millions of heat pumps, tons of building material for green buildings, everything, every vehicle transition, energy sources, alternative transition, and transforming production of everything from food to personal goods to low carbon, and training the people involved in the green practices. But we got to make sure that equity is part of this agenda and that Indigenous rights is part of this agenda. So I'm going to, as we go through the discussion, I'm going to dig down on some examples that actually are important to think about. The New York Climate Jobs efforts, the Toronto Better Buildings Partnership, the Manitoba First Nations geothermal projects, the Carpenters' support for mass timber, and Made in Canada Matters fight that we hear here. But I'll end by saying this: regulation, the experience of us in the health and safety movement that I've been involved in for 50 years, is that change doesn't come by asking corporations nicely to do something better. You have to regulate the bastards in order to get toxic material out of workplaces, in order to force them to put people in front of profits. Regulations are a huge piece of this conversation, and I'm going to come back to the examples later on.
I think that was a really good way to place the story for discussion. We've seen bits and pieces of a thread, and that thread that we've heard from all three of our presenters is really about, this is something that we're considering for 100% of us instead of just like a 1% of us. And we've also heard that the green industrial policy is the way that we can actually incorporate all the things that we already know we need to have for a just transition into a coordinated legislative and policy space. And yeah, this is a huge undertaking. I know I said it at the beginning, and I think I said it after each of the speakers. This is a very, very big choreography of a dance that we are trying to pull together collectively. I wanted to just, I guess, before I open up the floor for discussions and further interventions from our speakers, is to just also pick up on that 1% piece, and also some of the historical elements that we've heard. Is that how many of you were involved in the anti-globalization movement in some way? Where we're at now, and what this really is this is actually the culmination of the anti-globalization movement. What we're seeing now, what just transition really is our fight that continues on the backs of all of those that were part of the anti-globalization movement for really, that society that we keep talking about, which is a society for 100% of us, instead of just, I mean, not even a 1%. Like what did you say? 260,000 workers in the oil and gas industry, and what, 60,000 workers in forestry?
There's about 20 million workers. in
20
Canada.
million workers. Like, so it's an economy of scale. I mean, if we're going to talk economics, let's talk economies of scale as well. So the synthesis also continues, which is the way that we can achieve all of these things is actually by public ownership and understanding that that is not just the way that we can get to prioritizing things that work as opposed to things that make money, but it is also a process that enables necessary coordination, right? Necessary coordination across the federal government, but also with all of its other jurisdictional partners. And I would posit that that also implies that they must have nation-to-nation discussions in the process of doing anything like a green industrial policy. The third piece that we heard little bits sort of rear its head, and this is where the technical placeholder really is that we know that nothing is ever changed by thoughts and prayers. No offense to those that do thoughts and prayers, but we really do have to regulate. We know this historically. We also have heard that this is actually part of a history of transition. This is not the first time that the nation state of Canada has had to do an industrial transition. And it's not the first time that any of the G7 countries have had to do industrial transition. The other countries within our sphere, what they've understood and taken on is using the green industrial policy as the way of synthesizing a just transition body of legislation. And in a way, that's kind of what I guess we're talking about. But the takeaway from this is people want to do something collectively. That's one thing that I've heard is finding a choreography together to compel something like a national green industrial strategy. And that's really kind of amazing to hear. The second thing that I heard collectively is we have capacity building to do together, like public education and capacity building amongst ourselves, first of all, so that we're all kind of working from the same song sheet, I guess, to be quite cliche. But I do see that another really important piece of this is how do we start engaging in deeper and more meaningful ways with different segments of the public. And by different segments, I mean all of the different segments that we always know we have to be engaging with, which is, like, I think our public unions are really important. I think this is a really important discussion for PSAC and CUPE, not just the industrial unions, right? And it's because I think what I heard is we're talking about how do we, probably not going to like the way I'm framing this, but from a systems perspective, how do we reframe our economy literally from a perspective of a supply chain? So we're looking at what do we need for our communities and our workers first and foremost, right? Is it the start of the supply chain? So it's re-envisioning the cake, really, is what I'm doing in a different way. I feel like the cake is a really good way to visualize it. The supply chain might be the way to operationalize a discussion around how we develop a green industrial policy as a people's platform. So what next? Well, there's a group of us that have come together to start thinking about how do we actually coordinate all the different things that are happening in civil society in this country that are bits and pieces of a green industrial strategy for Canada. And right now we're calling it Get a Grip, because Get a Grip actually doesn't sound very good, but Get a Grip is green industrial policy. And it's actually, some of the members of that group are the ones that presented to you today. And we're really working on how do we synthesize everything that we've just talked about today into really motivating a real platform for this, to compel the federal government to do the one thing that they're actually supposed to do as a federal government, which is economic planning for the nation state. And I think that the next step is, as we go forward together, I would hope, is that we understand how you're at the common platform of the Green Economy Network is actually integral to everything that we just started to throw out onto the table today, and to see how we coordinate different spaces like Blue Green with the Green Economy Network, with CAN, with all of these other spaces where we're active and we're really struggling to figure out how to do that choreography. And I'm going to shush now and just thank our speakers. Like, you guys were really amazing at telling the story in a way that helps, I think, us understand what we're looking at. And also thanks to the Green Economy Network for the space to do this.
That was Christine Jones of Blue Green Canada in conversation with Hadrian Mertens-Kirkwood of the CCPA, Angela McEwen of QP National, and John Cartwright of the Council of Canadians on green industrial policy and what it means for Canada. You can find the Green Economy Network's updated common platform at greeneconomynet.ca. If you like this conversation, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy, on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadband Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca.